Very few studios have left as significant a mark on video game history as idSoftware. They quite simply, among other achievements, created modern FPS games with titles that had such a monumental impact and laid such solid foundations that they're now recognized as pioneers. And yet, this was anything but predictable, as idSoftware started with no reputation and released dozens of forgotten games before finding success. This is the story of one of the most peculiar studios in the world of video games, a studio that would go on to shape some of the industry's greatest trends. It's also the tale of how four extraordinarily talented individuals, brought together by chance, joined forces to leave an indelible mark on video game history. It's 1979, and a young American boy just over 10 years old named John Romero, whose name stands out due to his Mexican and indigenous heritage, is captivated by a groundbreaking arcade game, Space Invaders. The concept of interacting with a screen that responds to his actions fascinates him. Not long after, Pac-Man arrives in arcades, and once again John is enthralled. This sparks a deep desire to create games of his own. A few years later, he receives his first computer, an Apple II, and begins experimenting with programming. As he develops his skills, he starts designing his own games. Eager to share his work, he sends his creations to specialized magazines. At the time, these magazines either printed game codes directly on their pages, requiring readers to manually input them, or included floppy disks with preloaded games. In 1984, one of his games is selected for publication in Insider magazine. At just 16 years old, Romero's talent is recognized, marking the start of his journey into the world of game development. Romero doesn't stop. He keeps going for weeks, months, and eventually years. He tirelessly programs games and submits them to magazines, relishing the entire process. His expertise in programming on the Apple II steadily grows. By the time he turns 20, after 8 years of developing games, he joins Origin Systems. There, he focuses on porting games from the Commodore 64 or Macintosh to the Apple II. Recognizing the significant demand for such services, he founds his first company, Capital Ideas Software, followed by Inside Out Software. However, it's with Ideas from the Deep that he begins to find greater success. By 1989, at just 22 years old, John Romero has already programmed over 74 games, a staggering achievement and a testament to his talent, especially for someone so young. As Romero continues to produce games, he catches the attention of Softdisk, a Louisiana-based company that publishes games through the magazines of the time. Softdisk employs a small team of developers, each working independently on their own projects. During this period, PC games remain relatively simple, especially those included in magazines. As a result, it's common for a single developer to handle the entire creation process. However, as PCs advance and Romero sets his sights on creating more ambitious games, working alone becomes increasingly challenging. Tight deadlines, requiring him to design and code a new game every month, make it nearly impossible to keep up alone. At Softdisk, Romero encounters a young man around his age named John Carmack. Carmack also works as a programmer, and as they chat, they realize how closely aligned their paths are, beyond sharing the same first name. Carmack, too, was enchanted by Space Invaders, deeply moved by Pac-Man, and shares Romero's admiration for Shigeru Miyamoto games. The Mario and Zelda titles consistently astound both of them, and after forming a friendship, they quickly collaborate on a project, Dark Designs 2, a sequel to one of Carmack's previous work. Before long, Romero establishes his own division within Softdisk, publishing a monthly PC game under the name Gamer's Edge. He brings John Carmack into the team, along with Adrian Carmack, unrelated to John Carmack, who works as an artist. The trio begins programming games together. Before long, Romero convinces Tom Hall, another programmer, to regularly join them in the evenings. Together, they form a group called Ideas from the Deep, like Romero's previous company, abbreviated as IDF. Romero is thrilled to finally have colleagues who share his passion and ambitions, offering mutual support. As he later reflects, after each of us spent a decade making games alone, we suddenly found ourselves with colleagues who shared the same passion, the same goals, and whom we could sometimes lean on. It was magical for us. It's September 1990, and this group begins developing games together while continuing their roles at Softdisk. One of their early projects is Catacomb, a top-down third-person shooter where players navigate a multi-level dungeon. The game achieves moderate success, motivating the team to continue producing games on a monthly basis. By early 1991, they shift their focus to a shoot-'em-up, a highly popular genre at the time but rare on PCs. The primary challenge lies in the limitations of PCs, particularly with smooth scrolling. Computers of that era weren't designed to handle such graphics efficiently. However, John Carmack devises clever programming techniques to achieve vertical scrolling for the release of Slordax, a shoot-'em-up. While the game isn't a major success, something about its code continues to nag at Carmack. He's determined to tackle a lingering challenge, achieving smooth scrolling in all directions. Though this task might seem trivial, consoles like the Famicom have done it as early as 1984 with Excitebike. PCs weren't as optimized for pixel manipulation, making it a unique and significant hurdle. Against the odds, Carmack succeeds in creating fluid multi-directional scrolling, an accomplishment that excites him deeply. Eager to showcase his breakthrough, he teams up with Tom Hall. The two work feverishly until 5 a.m., creating a demo titled Dangerous Dave in copyright infringement. They save it onto a floppy disk and leave it on Romero's desk. The next morning, John Romero finds the disk on his desk, starts it up, tests the demo, and is blown away. Around this time, a game is taking the world by storm, Super Mario Bros. 3. It's a phenomenal success, praised for its incredible richness and power-ups, levels, and environments. The technical achievement is also noteworthy, as it brings these features to a simple 8-bit console. Super Mario Bros. 3 features smooth scrolling in all directions, and like everyone else, Romero and Carmack are swept up in the Super Mario Bros. 3 frenzy. The small demo they created is, in fact, the first level of Super Mario Bros. 3. Romero believes they're onto something big. After their regular work hours, they toil day and night on a port of Super Mario Bros. 3, meticulously copying sprites and recreating levels. In a photo, you can see the NES connected, with Mario Bros. 3 on the screen, while Romero and Carmack painstakingly recreate the levels one by one. They commit to this intense effort because a few years earlier, Hudson had ported some Nintendo games to microcomputers, and Nintendo had published them. Romero and Carmack hope to collaborate with Nintendo, not only on games they admire, but also to potentially work with the company. After more than a week of relentless work, they finish the port and send it to Nintendo, eagerly anticipating their reaction and hoping for a positive response. When Nintendo reviews their work, they are stunned by what Romero and Carmack have accomplished. They express their admiration for the port, but firmly refuse to allow their games to be released on platforms other than their own, reminding the team they don't have the rights to do so. It's a harsh wake-up call, a cold shower for their ambitions. However, a chance encounter with a man named Scott Miller changes everything. Miller works at idSoftware, a shareware publisher revolutionizing the PC gaming industry with its innovative distribution model. Shareware involves offering a game or a portion of it for free, with players paying only if they want access to the full version. It's somewhat like giving away the first world of Super Mario Bros. 3 for free and charging for the rest of the levels. Scott Miller is a fan of Softdisk games and plays them regularly. He notices that some, particularly those created by Romero and Carmack, are exceptionally well-suited to the shareware model. While playing Pyramids of Egypt, he spots John Romero's name and decides to reach out to him about publishing his games. Knowing that Softdisk wouldn't allow direct contact, Miller devises a more discreet plan. "I noticed that Softdisk had some great games that fit perfectly with the shareware format," Miller later explained. One of them was made by John Romero. Since I knew Softdisk wouldn't let me contact him directly, I took a subtler approach. I wrote and sent him a bunch of fan letters. Eventually, Romero noticed they all came from the same address. He got annoyed and sent me a letter calling me a psychopath. But that led to us talking on the phone and eventually negotiating together. In the end, they agreed to let me publish their game, Commander Keen. Despite Nintendo's rejection, IDF quickly recovers by reusing their technology and engine for a new game, Commander Keen. While it draws some inspiration from Mario games, it is far from a direct clone. The game introduces unique mechanics, including a pogo stick for exploration, and features a narrative-driven opening sequence. While some elements may feel reminiscent of certain Mario titles, the game is distinctly their own creation. idSoftware agrees to publish Commander Keen, and it becomes a surprising success, largely thanks to its advanced technology for the time, including smooth scrolling in all directions, a standout feature on PCs of the era. When Al Vakovius, CEO of Softdisk, learns about the success of Commander Keen, he is furious. The game was created using Softdisk's equipment and resources, and more importantly, he fears the company's best developers might leave after their newfound success. In response, Vakovius takes legal action to force the team to remain at Softdisk for an additional 2 years. Romero, John Carmack, and Adrian Carmack are disappointed but initially resign to spending 2 more years creating small games for Softdisk. However, Scott Miller steps in, securing an excellent lawyer to negotiate their release. The result is a compromise. Instead of 2 years, they are required to produce 1 game per month for Softdisk for just 6 months. On February 1, 1991, John Romero, Adrian Carmack, John Carmack, and Tom Hall officially established their own company, naming it idSoftware, and not idSoftware. The name stems from their earlier group name IFD, with the F removed. More importantly, id reflects the term in demand, a phrase they had used while searching for significant projects. However, they ultimately keep the name simply because they think it's cool, idSoftware. While things appear promising, challenges quickly arise. On one hand, they must fulfill their contractual obligations to Softdisk, developing a game each month. On the other hand, their future hinges on the success of their games sold via idSoftware's shareware model to generate revenue for their fledgling company. Effectively, they now have 2 full-time jobs. Despite these hurdles, the team remains undeterred. They are driven by ambitious goals, which they will soon bring to life with revolutionary projects that will forever change the gaming world. Shortly after the release of Commander Keen, idSoftware set out to expand the series with 2 sequels. These new entries introduced some gameplay variations, but remained closely aligned with the original. The rapid release of these sequels was made possible by a brilliant innovation, implementing an independent engine logic. idSoftware designed their game engines, the core programs that handle physics, movement, and graphics, in a modular way, allowing them to be reused with ease by simply swapping out the game data. This approach enabled them to release 3 Commander Keen games in quick succession. The idea of separating the game engine from the game's assets also sparked another revolutionary concept, leasing their engine to other developers for a fee. To showcase its potential, they organized a seminar, inviting developers to see the engine in action. During the demonstration, they swapped out Commander Keen's data for another game within minutes, emphasizing how user-friendly and adaptable the engine was. The developers were impressed, and some began licensing the engine. Even idSoftware joined in, contributing additional revenue for idSoftware. Unbeknownst to them at the time, idSoftware had just sparked a revolution in the gaming industry, the public licensing of game engines. This concept would go on to form the foundation of modern game development, with tools like Unity, Unreal Engine, CryEngine, and many others following the same model. Remarkably, idSoftware achieved this groundbreaking innovation in 1991. What's even more clever is how they managed to keep other developers occupied with the Commander Keen engine while they moved forward, developing new technologies and preparing to redefine the industry yet again. Shortly after, idSoftware released Dangerous Dave and the Haunted Mansion. Originally a game released the previous year by John Romero, this sequel was light years ahead of its predecessor. While the first was a run-of-the-mill platformer, this sequel changed the game entirely. The once ordinary hero became much cooler, now blasting zombies and monsters with a shotgun. The monsters decomposed upon being shot. A reloading mechanic added tension, and detailed large sprites made the game visually compelling. Check out the difference between the two games, even though they're only a year apart. It's the most beautiful game they had ever released. John Carmack felt like he had reached the limits of what could be done in 2D with this game. It led him to ponder a new question. Is it possible to do 3D? He noticed that, aside from a few exceptions like Flight Simulator, there were hardly any 3D games on PC, especially not 3D action games. John Carmack was someone who wanted to do what others couldn't, so whenever he had the time, he experimented with it. Initially, he created a 3D environment, but it lagged horribly. PCs of that era simply lacked the power to handle 3D. Then he had a major optimization idea. Why have the computer calculate the entire 3D area when only a part of it is visible? He introduced ray casting, allowing the PC to calculate and display only what's in front of the player, recalculating with each movement. Thanks to this ray casting, in just 6 weeks, he created a game engine capable of displaying a 3D environment with 2D sprite enemies. In April 1991, idSoftware released their first game using their groundbreaking technology, Hover Tank 3D. The game featured an impressive 3D environment with fast, smooth performance and 2D sprite enemies. Players navigated a simple maze, rescuing civilians and defeating monsters that exploded into pools of blood. This marked idSoftware's first foray into the FPS genre, transitioning from small 8-bit games to a 3D FPS in record time. However, despite its technical achievements, Hover Tank 3D failed to capture significant attention from PC gamers. Strangely enough, it was Duke Nukem, which utilized idSoftware's scrolling technology, shared by Romero with Todd Replogle, that gained popularity that same year. idSoftware seemed to be advancing too quickly for the public, which wasn't quite ready for the 3D revolution. Meanwhile, the team remained tied to their contractual obligations with Softdisk. They hastily released sequels to Rescue Rover and Titles of the Dragon to fulfill their commitments, allowing them to focus on a new trilogy in the Commander Keen series. For this new installment, they borrowed a composer from Apogee Software, adding music to their games, something not yet standard in PC gaming. They also significantly enhanced the visuals, creating longer games, more levels, detailed sprites, and faster scrolling. This effort culminated in their ultimate 2D platformer, making Commander Keen the biggest success for both idSoftware and Apogee Software. Ironically, their cutting-edge 3D game, Hover Tank 3D, went largely unnoticed, while their return to 2D brought massive success. Yet idSoftware remained determined to push forward with 3D technology, as they saw its potential for innovation. For their final game under Softdisk, they released a sequel to Catacomb, the game that had originally brought them together years earlier. The sequel, Catacomb 3D, symbolized their rapid evolution, featuring large, open levels, destructible walls, secret passages, and an enhanced version of John Carmack's engine. This time, the engine introduced texture mapping, a technique that applied textures, such as metal or stone, to 3D surfaces, creating richer and more immersive environments compared to the plain walls in Hover Tank 3D. Despite these advancements, Catacomb 3D didn't achieve the success they had hoped for. Romero felt the game wasn't as fun as it could be, and sales reflected this sentiment. By December 1991, idSoftware was finally free from their obligations to Softdisk, but they found themselves at a crossroads. While their instinct was to create another Commander Keen trilogy, given its proven success, they were growing tired of the series. The team yearned for something fresh and were eager to experiment further with John Carmack's 3D engine. John Romero casually proposed an idea: a 3D remake of Quake Wolfenstein, a 1980s classic set during World War II, where players control a prisoner trying to escape a Nazi camp. The game combined elements of infiltration, combat, and disguise, and had been a favorite of the idSoftware team a decade earlier. The idea excited the group, particularly Adrian Carmack, who was drawn to its darker, more violent tone, a stark contrast to the child-friendly Commander Keen. As the concept gained momentum, Romero revised his vision. Instead of focusing on Castle Wolfenstein's stealth and impersonation mechanics, he wanted to streamline the experience. His vision was a fast-paced, noisy action game focused entirely on shooting enemies and collecting gear. He believed simplicity was key. 3D gaming was still in its infancy, and the general public wasn't ready for complexity. A straightforward, action-packed concept would make the game accessible and allow for a high-energy, fast-moving experience. John Romero was convinced of two key principles during the development of the next game. First, a technical revolution had to be gradual. Video games were becoming increasingly complex, and players needed time to adapt. Second, success depended on creating something unique. At the time, the PC gaming market was saturated with strategy games, platformers, and simulations. This new game, however, would stand apart, occupying a unique place in PC gaming. Despite some initial reservations, the team began working with enthusiasm. John Carmack focused on improving his 3D engine, increasing resolution, and ensuring smoother performance. Adrian Carmack hand-drew every enemy in the game, meticulously animating each frame, which contributed to a darker, grittier aesthetic. Tom Hall designed most of the levels, adding immersive elements like moving enemies, treasure chests with collectible items, and distinct bosses. Meanwhile, John Romero experimented with gameplay concepts using Carmack's engine, testing features like looting enemy bodies, moving them to hide evidence, and stealth-based infiltration. Yet by the end, Romero decided to strip away these mechanics, believing they disrupted the fast-paced action he envisioned. In the middle of development, a hurdle emerged. SoftDisk reminded idSoftware that they still owed one final game. The team, absorbed in their ambitious new project, neither had the time nor the desire to fulfill this obligation. Enter Scott Miller of Apogee Software, who arranged for a quick replacement game, Scuba Adventure, to be created on their behalf. Meanwhile, SoftDisk began releasing games using the Catacomb 3D engine, which they owned the rights to. This put idSoftware in a strange position of having to compete against their earlier work, adding extra pressure to outperform their past achievements. Despite these challenges, the team pressed forward with confidence. Drawing inspiration from the maze-like design of Pac-Man, they finalized the levels. John Carmack implemented movable walls to conceal secrets. Adrian Carmack added violent, visceral animations, and Hall crafted a narrative to tie the game together. However, one crucial component was missing: sound. They brought back Bobby Prince, a former U.S. Army soldier, to handle sound design. Prince used his military experience, a keyboard, and a tape recorder to create weapon sounds, alongside other effects that added depth and intensity to the game. By this point, idSoftware had also caught the attention of FormGen, a PC game publisher. FormGen, impressed by the success of the Commander Keen series, offered to release the new game through the traditional pay-to-play model alongside the shareware format. However, FormGen soon raised concerns about the game's violence and graphic content. In response, idSoftware doubled down, embracing the controversy. They added lifeless bodies to the labyrinths, blood-streaked walls, enemies exploding in pools of gore, and piercing screams. They even included a certain regime's infamous anthem on the title screen. Romero believed this shock factor would make the game unforgettable and cement its uniqueness. Once development was complete, the team embarked on an intensive testing phase, playing the game non-stop for a month. They uncovered bugs, made countless tweaks, and polished the experience. One lingering issue was the title. The team wanted to call the game Wolfenstein 3D, but the Wolfenstein name was trademarked. After some investigation, they discovered the rights belonged to an individual following the bankruptcy of the original company. Determined, they purchased the rights for $5,000, a testament to how vital the name was to their vision. By the end of development, idSoftware had overcome numerous obstacles, adapting to evolving graphics card standards, reworking sound for older hardware, juggling relocations, and pouring $40,000 into the project. At last, they had their game, a product of immense collaboration and ambition. What they didn't fully anticipate was just how much this game would redefine gaming history. On May 5, 1991, Wolfenstein 3D was released, quickly gaining attention through word of mouth and its shareware distribution model, which offered the first 10 levels for free. Despite limited PC ownership at the time, the game sold tens of thousands of copies per month. It even received international acclaim, including coverage in Famitsu, a major Japanese gaming magazine that typically shunned violent games. However, the magazine praised its smooth performance, intuitive interface, and innovative design, aligning perfectly with John Romero's vision. Wolfenstein 3D received numerous awards, including Best Action Game and Most Innovative Game from Video Games and Computer Entertainment, the Cody Award, and accolades from Game Bytes readers. Critics hailed it as the best PC arcade game of its time, lauding its endless fun, enjoyable violence, and immersive gameplay. What set Wolfenstein 3D apart was its bold, uncompromising design. In an era dominated by the Nintendo versus Sega rivalry, with Mario and Sonic battling for younger audiences, Wolfenstein carved out a unique niche. Its extreme violence, forbidden symbols, exploding enemies, and pools of blood shocked and captivated players. It was also a technical marvel, boasting 3D visuals, realistic weapon sounds, responsive AI, unlockable doors, varied weapons, tension-building music, and even German-speaking enemies. These elements, combined with the shareware model, ensured wide accessibility. The engine's efficiency allowed the game to run smoothly, even on less powerful PCs, a pleasant surprise for many. The results were extraordinary. While Commander Keen generated $10,000 per month at its peak, Wolfenstein 3D averaged $200,000 per month for 18 months, earning $2.5 million over 3 years. Remarkably, 25% of its revenue came from international sales, despite no marketing outside the US and bans in certain countries. idSoftware further monetized the game by licensing its engine to other developers, increasing their earnings. Following the game's release, the team focused on Wolfenstein 3D extensions to maximize its success and profits. However, John Carmack, uninterested in extensions and subsequent projects, continued pushing the boundaries of video games. During the extension development phase, he evolved his 3D engine, enabling walls of any angle and shape, a significant advancement for creating a more realistic world. While others were occupied with extensions, John Carmack conceived a new concept, Doom, a game where players battle demons inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, a role-playing game they frequently played. The team, now joined by artist Kevin Cloud, embraced Carmack's basic pitch, and the project started in November 1992. Tom Hall wrote the Doom Bible, an extensive design document that included various ideas and a detailed story. However, Carmack's engine couldn't support a large, interconnected world, forcing them to revert to a series of levels deviating from Hall's original storyline. On January 1, 1993, when the project was still in its infancy, idSoftware issued a press release announcing Doom. The release promised to push the limits of what was thought possible on PCs, offering a revolutionary, technically advanced game with multiplayer capabilities, surpassing Wolfenstein in fluidity and beauty. These promises, made when the game was barely in development, set the stage for a pressured development cycle, unlike their previous games, which seemingly appeared out of nowhere. Tom Hall then rewrote the entire Doom Bible to align with Carmack's vision and the level sequels, but Romero wasn't a fan. Carmack didn't even bother reading it, stating, "The story in a game is like the story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important." This hit Hall hard. For their previous games, id Software never bothered with a design document, questioning the need for one now when Hall wanted to take things further, have a more controlled development, and add stakes to the fights with a narrative. However, other team members were indifferent. Adrian Carmack and Kevin Cloud were tasked with designing monstrous creatures based on aliens. Initially, they drew sketches that impressed the team, fitting well with the desired atmosphere. For Wolfenstein, Adrian Carmack painstakingly drew sprites and animation frames. However, given the variety of enemies for Doom, a different solution was needed. They created clay statues based on the sketches, photographed them, and then digitized them to obtain sprites from various angles and animations without the laborious process of drawing each one individually. Although this method required substantial work for each enemy, they also hired Gregor Punchatz, who created some enemies through small sculptures assembled from various objects, again embracing nightmarish ideas. Meanwhile, Carmack and Romero delved into the game engine, introducing two significant innovations. Firstly, instead of using ray tracing to calculate light trajectory and intensity, Carmack calculated the distance between surfaces and light sources. Consequently, the intensity of the surface light depended on its distance from light sources and the player. The closer it got, the more realistic the light became. The second innovation involved Carmack implementing WAD, standing for Where Are the Data? This detached the game's levels from the engine, allowing independent level design. Influenced by the mods and levels created by Wolfenstein fans, Carmack even planned to distribute a level editor for fans to create their own levels freely. On the level design front, Tom Hall started creating levels based on real military bases for added realism. However, when Romero reviewed them, he found them subpar and decided to discard them, opting to design the levels himself. Frustrated, Hall, who had spent hours on the Doom Bible, had felt unheard in meetings, and had his levels ignored, became less involved in the project. The team noticed, and in agreement with Romero, Carmack decided to let Hall go. Tom Hall, one of id Software's founders who significantly contributed to the success of Commander Keen and Wolfenstein, was dismissed, adding tension and pressure. As id Software struggled under the weight of this challenging development, several events would further complicate the process. After Tom Hall's departure, the project faced significant delays in level creation. id Software struggled to find a replacement who aligned with their philosophy. Several weeks later, they hired Sandy Peterson to fulfill the designer role alongside John Romero. Both designers approached levels differently. Romero focused on technically showcasing the game engine's innovations, incorporating special stairs and personally programming switch-controlled doors. On the other hand, Peterson crafted bewildering levels that disoriented players with traps and unconventional elements. Romero was highly satisfied with their collaborative work. Early in Doom's development, the publisher Imagineer acquired the rights to Wolfenstein 3D, commissioning id Software to port it to Super Nintendo for an upfront payment of $100,000. Despite taking the money, id Software left the project on hold for months. As the delivery date approached and with no time to complete the port, they hired someone who struggled with it, not grasping the Wolfenstein engine. By March 1993, left with no choice, Romero and Carmack decided to do it themselves. Rapidly learning how to program a Super Nintendo game, they completed the port by reducing texture resolution, removing ray casting to prevent lag without fully adapting the game. Nintendo insisted on removing symbols deemed offensive, German-speaking guards, and replacing dogs with giant rats. They also created a port for the Atari Jaguar to avoid revisiting the task. Throughout Doom's development, investors frequently called, urging id Software to go public, promising substantial wealth. However, the company consistently refused, prioritizing creative freedom and independence. Larger corporations attempted to acquire them, including Microsoft later on. Despite promises of immense sums, id Software was determined to remain free. Facing a lack of promotional tools, idSoftware sent beta versions to magazines and journalists, a strategy they had previously used with Wolfenstein. However, this time, the demos leaked, spreading rapidly. They received calls from players complaining about bugs and sound issues, unaware it was a beta version without finalized audio. The anticipation for the game grew, leading to demands for an earlier release or explanations for the delay. The immense expectation was a new experience for idSoftware, who previously released games that emerged seemingly out of nowhere. Similar to Wolfenstein 3D, they enlisted Bobby Prince to create music and sound effects. However, this time, Romero insisted that Prince compose music inspired by popular metal bands. Prince disagreed, advocating for ambient music to enhance realism and immersion in a game focused on realism. In response, he composed both ambient and metal tracks, but Romero disregarded the former, sticking to his preference for metal. Sound effects were crafted with the same imaginative approach as Wolfenstein, utilizing noises and screams from a dental office next to their office. By November 1993, the game was ready, but John Carmack decided to incorporate multiplayer functionality, a new venture for him. Learning networking engineering by reading a book, he swiftly integrated functional multiplayer in just a few days. Romero and Carmack quickly conceptualized what they called Deathmatch, a mode for up to 4 players where participants had to locate each other and engage in combat. Romero explained the inspiration behind this idea. During our breaks, we constantly played combat games like Street Fighter II, Fatal Fury, or Art of Fighting, and we would insult each other and throw things around. We can say that Japanese combat games influenced our desire to create deathmatch modes in our games. In the final weeks, idSoftware's CEO at the time, Jay Wilbur, decided to bypass Apogee Software and publish the game themselves. Despite being financially capable, they opted for minimal advertising, allowing retailers to sell the first part of the game at their preferred price to encourage promotion and follow the shareware model. Finally, the game was ready, and as idSoftware was still recovering from the impact of Wolfenstein 3D, they had no inkling of the seismic effect Doom's arrival would cause. Throughout 1993, PC gaming magazines consistently covered Doom, fueled by the beta versions they received. idSoftware even featured in a television show, showcasing the beta gameplay, a remarkable occurrence for that era. The anticipation was enormous, and on December 10, 1993, after 30 straight hours of testing, idSoftware uploaded the first part of Doom online, accessible for free on the University of Wisconsin servers. However, the server crashed, as 10,000 people attempted to download the game simultaneously. After restoring service, players freely shared the initial levels, rapidly spreading across the gaming community. Subsequent levels were available for purchase. The players' response was overwhelming. They loved the game and engaged so much in multiplayer that it overloaded most U.S. public servers. Consequently, John Carmack released a patch to optimize connections and restrict Doom on those servers. In a single night, the game became profitable, earning $100,000 in a day, surpassing Wolfenstein's monthly earnings. Within a few weeks, they accumulated $1 million in revenue. The momentum continued month after month, so much so that by late 1995, Doom was installed on more computers than Windows 95, generating $9 million in revenue in the United States alone. Additionally, numerous studios sought to license their game engine, the Doom engine, leading to the creation of games like Heretic or Hexen, and many others, further increasing idSoftware's earnings. And the reception from journalists is even more grandiose, even though some criticize the repetitive gameplay. Edge points out that it's a shame you can only kill the creatures. They finish by explaining that if you could talk to them and form alliances, it would be more interesting, which became a recurring joke in the Doom community. Nevertheless, most of the gaming journalists are won over. PC Gamer, Computer Gaming World, Games Radar, Cybermania, and others award it the title of the best game of the year. PC Zone calls it the best arcade game in history. The accompanying comments are highly laudatory. a thrilling 3D adventure carried by superb technology. The best adrenaline rush on PC, the most intense gaming experience, the best multiplayer game. PC Gamer even boldly states that it's not only the PC game with the most impact ever released, but also the best PC game in the history of video games. Games Master, The Independent, Entertainment Weekly, Polygon, The Times, Game React, and many others designate it as one of the best games in the history of video games, and one of the most revolutionary games of all time. The game's atmosphere and artistic direction are also acclaimed. Doom has just succeeded in putting PC gaming in the spotlight, at a time when PC gamers are scarce and consoles reign supreme. The impact of Doom is unprecedented. Doom is so popular that its advent is seen as the birth of modern FPS, first-person shooter games. While there were FPS games before Doom, Wolfenstein being one, Doom reached so many players that it became the first FPS for many. For a long time, people didn't refer to FPS games, but rather as Doom-like or Doom clones. It was so popular and left such an impression that it created an entirely new type of game that the general public had never seen before. The general public, which, until then, mainly associated video games with a flood of platformers driven by the enormous success of games like Mario and Sonic. In addition to that, Doom also popularized multiplayer gaming, serving as many players' first multiplayer experience with integrated deathmatch, which has become indispensable and still thrives today. Playing against other players seemed magical at a time when gamers were accustomed to playing only against CPUs. Doom also popularized modding. Since Doom reached so many players, numerous communities formed and started using the level editor provided by John Carmack to create their own levels, share them for free, and sometimes even mod the game directly, transforming it into a different game. This was entirely intentional on the part of John Carmack and Romero. In fact, shortly after the explosion of level editors, they updated Doom's legal terms, explicitly stating that it was allowed to sell mods of the game without paying anything to idSoftware. This led to an explosion in the number of mods created by these communities. One of these communities even went on to create speedruns. Thanks to the ability to save performance in small files that could be exchanged and replayed, players began sharing their best performances and engaging in crazy challenges like killing everyone with only their fists, or killing as few monsters as possible. Some still undertake these difficult challenges even today, more than 30 years after its release. In addition to all of this, Doom also popularized the shareware economic model, which still exists today, distributing the beginning of a game for free and offering to pay only for the continuation became very common after its release. Moreover, the game was ported everywhere, to all consoles of the time. Since John Carmack even released the game's source code as open source, many independent developers started adapting it for all platforms. Doom is famous precisely for running on anything and everything. A few months after the release of Doom, idSoftware released Doom 2, which was also well received. It came out during the huge wave of popularity surrounding the title and introduced many great levels, new content, and pushed the concept of the first Doom even further. Certainly, a game that generates so much attention also attracts a lot of criticism. The early 90s marked the period when the general public began to express concerns about video games and their alleged danger to young audiences. Mortal Kombat serves as evidence, as it led to crisis meetings with a U.S. congressman and ultimately resulted in the establishment of the ESRB. Doom arrives just after this, precisely at a time when the dangers of video games are making headlines, and some countries like the United States are becoming wary of video games. Doom, being even more violent with blood, graphic violence, satanic images, insults, a level in the shape of a swastika, and many other controversial elements, is banned in countries like Germany. In April 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold committed one of the worst massacres in U.S. history, the Columbine High School Massacre. When it was discovered that they were active Doom players, going so far as to create levels for the game, the question of violence in video games returned to the forefront, with Doom still being singled out. On the other hand, This gave the game a cool, boundary-pushing image that adolescents and young adults loved at that time. Paradoxically, it greatly contributed to the explosion of its popularity. The violence in games was so rare at that time, especially for many players who had grown up with Nintendo and Sega consoles, and were now old enough to own a PC. Just the images of the game in magazines generated a lot of interest, and this violence was enjoyable in the context of a game. This aspect will also be responsible for the later massive success of the GTA games. With Doom, idSoftware managed in a single game to popularize PC gaming, online gaming, violence in games, and how it can be used intelligently, speedrunning, 3D gaming, the shareware economic model, letting players participate in the game's content, popularizing and even creating in people's minds first-person shooter as a genre that has become extremely dominant in the world of video games. Now the question is, how to follow up such a massive success? How to follow up such a massive success, how to meet the disproportionate expectations, how to innovate successfully. These are the questions that the members of idSoftware are grappling with, feeling like they've pushed their capabilities to the limit. Managing the success of Doom is not easy for a tiny company with just a handful of employees, and tensions began to surface. One significant effort made by idSoftware to foster connections and alleviate tensions is playing together. They engage in video games, including fighting games, and participate in role-playing campaigns like the popular Dungeons & Dragons. In the early days of their company, the team would gather every weekend to play. During these sessions, they get the idea to create an RPG for PC inspired by their Dungeons & Dragons campaign, incorporating their own characters. They were so excited about this concept that they even included a teaser in Commander Keen for a game called The Fight for Justice, featuring the hero named Quake, the Master of Lightning. Although they started working on it in early 1991, the PCs of that time were quite weak and had limited available memory. Creating an RPG came with many constraints, even though a few RPGs were released on PC at that time, such as the famous Ultima series. They had ambitious plans and didn't want to settle for a mediocre game. Instead, they decided to put this idea on hold and focus on the other projects. After Wolfenstein and Doom, it's 1994, and John Carmack realizes that the next significant evolution is true 3D. The Doom engine is, in fact, a 2D engine that gives the illusion of 3D. Levels are designed in 2D, and only during display does the engine incorporate the height of elements and apply them to walls, ceilings, textures, stairs, etc. This, however, limits the possible movements and scenarios, as there is no notion of height in the gameplay. You just have to face the enemies to hit them, no aiming concept, and there are strict constraints on the levels that can be designed due to the inability to have rooms above or below others, in addition to limited size zones. While his colleagues work on Doom 2 levels, John Carmack conducts tests to transform his engine into a true 3D engine. Suddenly, after the grand success of Doom, John Carmack and Romero decide that the next game will reuse the main character from the game abandoned several years earlier, as Sandy Peterson recounts. While we were designing Doom 2 data, John Carmack was working on a new 3D engine. And then after we finished Doom 2, both Johns sat down and said, "Our next game will be based on the D&D guy, Quake." The beginning of the Quake project is very challenging. It's only 1994, and PCs are struggling with 3D, at least for 3D environments at an acceptable frame rate. John Carmack has a hard time evolving his 3D engine. He needs to figure out how to store levels entirely in 3D mathematically. Storing entire levels with the limited memory available at that time is impossible. idSoftware has gotten used to relying on Carmack's advancements before starting to design their game. First, it's the technology, and then the game concepts that showcase their technical edge over others. However, this time, John Carmack needs a lot of time, and he's grappling a bit because he has to grasp this enormous novelty of 3D, which complicates everything. So the start of the project is genuinely chaotic. To aid them, they recruit a bit more staff, John Cash, to assist John Carmack with secondary programming tasks, and Tom Willits, newly hired after being noticed for his original levels shared online in Doom, and even American McGee, that's his real name, a designer who originally lived in the same building as John Carmack. Carmack invited him to test Doom from time to time, and with his insightful feedback, they recruited him as a game and level designer. He recalls the challenging beginnings of the Quake project. At the beginning of the project, a lot of work was done, then thrown in the trash, redone, then thrown in the trash again. And this happened several times over months. I designed many test levels for Carmack that ultimately didn't serve much purpose. McGee and Carmack became close friends outside of work, and McGee remembers how hard John Carmack worked to finally master this 3D realm. John Carmack never stopped working. He seemed to never sleep. He would come to my place at night to explain solutions to certain lighting or visual effects management problems in 3D. Or he would call me in the middle of the night to create test levels with specific requests. There were times when I went to his place and I felt like a monkey listening to Einstein talk about the mechanics of the universe in 3D. He talked about mathematical problems far beyond what I could understand, and I felt obliged to respond. Yes, that sounds very good. Initially, the tests were just generating boxes, then boxes within other boxes. At one point, we had a sphere to represent the player, then several spheres for multiplayer, and it continued to progress little by little. For the first time, John Carmack struggles to make concrete progress. He encounters many problems, and it's normal. He's trying to do something that almost no one had done at that time, and more importantly, he's trying to do it alone. As he keeps running into complex issues on his own, he starts to feel truly alone. No one seems to understand him, to grasp everything he's going through to design a 3D engine with so many prerequisites. Sandy Peterson recounts, John Carmack felt lonely. He wanted someone to talk to. He was programming a new game all alone, a game that was in true 3D. It was madness. So he decided to hire Mike Abrash, essentially to have someone knowledgeable in programming to talk to about all this and get his opinion. Mike Abrash is the author of the highly regarded books Graphics Programming and Power Graphics Programming, explaining how to optimize graphics display on a computer. He's well recognized in the field with extensive knowledge. In the middle of 1995, after months of slow progress, John Carmack and Abrash started working together to create the engine for the Quake project in true 3D. Abrash focused on optimizing the game's graphics in detail, while Carmack took care of everything else. Finally, the project started to move forward with significant improvements. During these difficulties, John Romero started thinking more precisely, and he has some ideas he would like to integrate into the game. I wanted to use this character we called Quake, accompanied by an ancient artifact that, during battles, would help suck in the enemies we're fighting. If we don't kill enough or not quickly enough, it would mock Quake and abandon him. Then you'd have to find it again. We would explore the world in the first person, but during battles, we could perform cool combos that we would see from a side view. Romero had in his mind the excellent Virtua Fighter, which has just created 3D fighting games, and he wants to draw inspiration to have clear and satisfying combat views with the same perspective. At the same time, he wants first-person exploration for immersion, with mountains to climb, forests to traverse, and many very vertical environments. He even mentions the idea of pushing the player from the top of the mountain to the bottom. Still, all these ideas will collide with the technical limitations. Carmack's engine isn't capable of displaying large 3D expanses. It requires too many resources for that era. In the end, they are forced to have a game that takes place indoors. And during all these months, each person works on their own, and towards the end of development, the game starts to have completely inconsistent content. A medieval castle, a military base, futuristic technologies with ancient artifacts. This happens because John Romero, the chief game designer, doesn't give any direction to anyone, as recalled by Peterson and Tom Willits. Romero was in charge of Quake's design. He was the chief game designer, but he gave no guidance to anyone. He just said, make levels and monsters. I asked the artist to draw me a cold, metallic palette, and at the same time, Romero asked them for a pallet for a space station. There was no decided story for Quake until we wrote a few lines on the back of the game box. That's why there are medieval castles, military bases, bizarre technologies, gods from ancient civilizations, different dimensions. There was no coherent game design. It was just, how can we put this together? Peterson senses the impending catastrophe, so he goes to see John Carmack and tells him that Romero is creating levels on his own, and no one knows where the project is going. He gives no instructions. They need to know where they're headed and what kind of levels to make, but Carmack trusts Romero, so he ignores the warnings from other employees. On the other hand, Romero wants to create an open world. He loves Zelda, often mentioning it in interviews. The first Zelda game is an open world where you can go to areas where enemies are super strong, even if you're not prepared, and when you die, you return to the starting area but can continue exploring elsewhere. That's what he has in mind, but he doesn't really talk to others about it. So the game is again designed as a series of levels, whereas initially he wanted a cohesive world. But besides that, Romero starts to be absent regularly. He goes to Doom tournaments, plays death matches with personalities, spends less and less time in the office, which annoys John Carmack. Carmack writes a software secretly that tracks the hours Romero spends at the office and installs it on his computer. Since its creation, idSoftware had the habit of never having a specification document, never really discussing their ideas. They just got used to working tremendously and always programming to minimize time spent discussing. At SoftDisk, they only had a month to make a game, and Tom Hall understood that during the development of Doom, that's why he created the Doom Bible. Still, he eventually got fired because of it. idSoftware relies so much on Carmack's technology and advancements that they never really knew what they were going to do at the beginning of a project. They always improvised. And it worked well because Carmack was advancing at the speed of light. So early on, they already had an idea of what he could do. But now that he's stumbling a bit, it's very difficult for everyone. They have to design levels without really knowing what's possible with Carmack's new engine, which he's in the process of programming. Moreover, Romero is busy with many other things. He has to design maps for the Ultimate Doom, a re-release in 1995 of Doom with even more levels. He pays amateurs to integrate their levels into Final Doom, a re-release of Doom 2. He also handles the interface with external studios that license the Doom engine and creates tools to simplify game development. Romero, who is supposed to be the project leader, is not often on the project because of all this. Consequently, the team is a bit lost, and the project moves forward without a clear direction. But on top of that, Romero completely stops working on the project to play Doom death matches against other employees. This starts to be reproached to him, but he explains that it's part of the job and that it inspires them to create Quake and figure out what to improve. As a result, the entire day is filled with yelling, arguing, insulting each other around Doom death matches. John Carmack is annoyed, and he starts coding from home to have some peace. Romero admits he went too far. Sometimes I play death matches all day. Looking back, if someone in my company did the same, I would have fired them quickly. And while the studio was on the verge of implosion, John Carmack decides to make a historic decision. John Carmack has had enough. He feels like he's carrying the studio on his shoulders. He realizes that what he considered friends are, in fact, just work colleagues. He finds himself having to manage the entire project and make all the major decisions, even though that wasn't necessarily what he wanted. Around September 1995, he makes a crucial decision. I remember the turning point for me was when McGee took a bunch of textures and elements from Doom and put them into the Quake engine to make some pieces of a level. I thought it looked beautiful with the lighting and polygons. The idea of just making another first-person shooter didn't seem so bad after all. John Carmack enters the open space where most developers work, what they called the war room, because tensions were high at that moment. Everyone was there, and Carmack announced that they were just going to make another first-person shooter, that they would have to throw away most of the work they had done so far, and that Quake would essentially be Doom but entirely in 3D in a different universe. You can imagine the desperate reaction of the other developers, but the upside is that Carmack has just finished the Quake engine, and it's extraordinary. Most members align with Carmack's decision, except for Romero, who recalls, "They just decided to add new weapons and make a Doom clone. Finish it as quickly as possible. It was ridiculous to me. Just plain bad. We've been developing games for 15 years. We have to offer something better than that. We are no longer in search of excellence. Okay, we've evolved our engine and technology, but we haven't evolved our game design." This is followed by 7 months of crunch. 7 months of intensive work where everyone works day and night, 7 months of regular disputes with a very tired team. The levels are created gradually, without much continuity between those designed by different people. Carmack is now focusing on the online mode, and designers Adrian Carmack and Kevin Cloud are overwhelmed with requests, and it continues like this day after day. The entire team realizes how much the transition to 3D complicates things enormously. Having to create 3D models for everything instead of sprites adds a lot of time, and the same goes for the levels where they have to create 3D environments. They feel like the development of this game will never end. One day, they receive an invitation from a very popular music group at that time, 9 Inch Nails, who are having a concert near their office. John Carmack and McGee attend, and after the concert, they spend the evening together. The members of idSoftware are fans of 9 Inch Nails' music, and the members of 9 Inch Nails are fans of Doom. There is mutual respect and admiration between the two, which stays in contact over the weeks. Naturally, the idea of a collaboration emerges. Members of 9 Inch Nails visit idSoftware's offices to see their upcoming game and think about what to compose. For Quake, idSoftware wants ambient music, somewhat like what Bobby Prince had in mind during the Doom era, where Romero eventually insisted on adding metal. Here, as everything is in 3D, and the immersion is meant to be even stronger than for Doom, ambient music is needed. 9 Inch Nails agrees to compose music for Quake, but it's the first time they have composed for a video game, and they had no idea of the task ahead, both in terms of volume and the different melodies required between the tracks, starting from scratch. They struggle initially because they compose the music in the same way as their band's music, before realizing it's completely different. Romero instructs them to have ambient sounds that fit various environments, with subtle melodies, allowing sound effects to always take precedence. For weeks, there are back and forths with idSoftware members about the music to compose. Since the provided music doesn't exactly match idSoftware's vision, McGee starts to tweak them to better fit the game. He also works on adjusting the sound effects. It becomes much more challenging than anyone had anticipated, adding another layer of complexity to this already very laborious project. In the end, though, idSoftware is satisfied with the music added to the game. Meanwhile, the studio is tearing itself apart around Tom Willits. He irritates his colleagues with his behavior, as Peterson recounts. Tim is the only team member for whom his rivals are not members of other studios, but members of his own studio. He wanted to rise above the others, while for us, we wanted to elevate idSoftware above other studios. He acted differently around certain colleagues, putting himself forward, and it created a lot of tension within the team. One day, Tim Willits tells Romero about an event that happened and then goes to John Carmack and tells a different version of the same event. When John Romero and John Carmack share the event, they realize that Willits tried to manipulate them. John Carmack is quite troubled because Willits made what he considers to be the best levels in his eyes. Therefore, he decides that the levels shared for free via the shareware model will be Willits's, which displeases Romero and Peterson greatly. Romero decides not to listen to John Carmack. The first level will be one of his, and the 6th, 7th, and 8th levels will be McGee's. Out of the first 8 levels, only 4 of them will be Willits's in the end. Finally, about 2 weeks before the release, just like with Doom, a beta version of Quake leaks online, irritating idSoftware. Moreover, a few days later, the hacker group ROR releases the final version of Quake before its official launch. However, shortly afterward, players realized that ROR just took the leaked beta, removed the word beta from the game code, and re-released it, lying about its content. This creates a lot of turmoil in the hacking scenes, and most importantly, it serves as great promotion for Quake. as everyone is eagerly awaiting the game. On June 22, 1996, at 4 a.m., Quake is finished. The studio is empty, with only John Romero there to upload Quake to the internet. In a matter of minutes, Quake spreads and gets downloaded worldwide at a staggering speed. However, it's not excitement that dominates John Romero. For the release of Quake, no one was there. Everyone was mentally destroyed. It was the first game we made where no one was there for the release. It was 4 a.m. when I uploaded it to the University of Wisconsin server. I was on IRC chats. The fans were overjoyed. Everyone was ecstatic, while I was there alone in this huge office. The reception of Quake is peculiar. Some magazines designate it as one of the best games in history, while others find it disappointing, viewing it as merely a 3D Doom. For many, it's the multiplayer aspect that will carry Quake, being much more robust and advanced than in Doom. However, the development team doesn't care much about this. Even though many journalists and players love the game and shower them with praise, the developers don't feel much. They are just extremely tired, and above all, they feel like they messed up in the end, wasting so many ideas and so much work, not enjoying the process of developing Quake. On one side, the world is enchanted by Quake. On the other, its own developers don't think it's that great. Romero still expresses this sentiment today. We knew that when Quake would come out, people would be enchanted because we were the first to release a game like this. But I was frustrated because if we had really taken the time to explore game design concepts, we would have created something much better. It was disappointing for me. Quake is good, but Doom is truly better. Adrian Carmack, Peterson, and Willits also share the same feeling. They don't feel for Quake what they felt for Doom. Even though Quake sells very well, they receive fan letters. Some journalists are ecstatic, and Quake becomes a cornerstone of esports with team competitions. Nothing can erase the bitter taste of a chaotic development. A team that fell apart, and a game that took twice as long to develop as Doom, which they still consider superior. It's incredible how idSoftware became so accustomed to releasing incredible games that they didn't even realize the feat they just accomplished. Realizing a fully 3D FPS on PC in 1996, with so many levels, weapons, environments, and a functional online mode. Remember the beginning of 1996, when 3D consoles arrived, and the first 3D games were disastrous. Consoles struggled to take off, and idSoftware not only introduced a significant technological innovation with this entirely 3D engine, but also a good game. They don't even realize that they had just released one of the most influential games in FPS history. Perhaps that's why idSoftware spends the following months improving Quake. They release vQuake, a port of the Quake engine that supports hardware acceleration for new graphics cards, significantly improving visuals and game smoothness with new lighting effects, anti-aliasing, and many other enhancements. In December 1996, idSoftware releases Quake World, a new version of the Quake engine that significantly improves the online gaming experience. It revolutionizes online gaming with a technology called client-side prediction. Basically, before its arrival, the player online would only see the result of their actions when the server sent back data. Now the game itself predicts what is supposed to happen, and the server corrects it, if necessary, a technology that will be used in a lot of games. A few weeks later, idSoftware releases WinQuake with DirectX support, making the game compatible with almost all computers running Windows. This explodes the game's popularity, coupled with its port to Nintendo 64 and Saturn. Quake also had a very significant impact because its turn towards more prevalent and widespread multiplayer and online modes is really what launched the massive trend of online FPS games, which are still among the most played games in the world today. Their foundation comes from Doom and especially Quake, both technically and through the ingenuity of the arenas for deathmatches, the available weapons, and even through fan mods, as the engine was cleverly designed to accept all kinds of modifications: gravity, weapons, levels, and even going further, since the source code of Quake was released online by Carmack, just like Doom and Wolfenstein 3D. Quake was so important at the time that it was one of the great founders of the era of massive LAN parties with dozens of players gathering for major tournaments and playing in a very friendly atmosphere amid passionate players. However, soon after the release of Quake, more than half of the studio leaves. Sean Green, Jay Wilbur, Sandy Peterson, Mike Wilson, and even John Romero, who was more or less fired by John Carmack. Since then, idSoftware has never been the same. John Romero, on the other hand, will found his own company, with which he will make Daikatana, one of the biggest critical and commercial failures in history. The game was heavily promoted by Romero, who gave many interviews and made many promises, such as creating a kind of fusion between Chrono Trigger, Zelda Ocarina of Time, and Quake. However, it underwent a chaotic development, with several changes to the game engine, a significant part of the development team resigning, and a huge mess that resulted in this game. This failure didn't prevent him from bouncing back and doing many other things afterward. Of course, idSoftware persisted, hired new people, released several sequels to Quake and Doom, which were also very well received, and the Carmack stayed there for quite some time. Still, idSoftware no longer had anything to do with the strange company of the early 90s, with this group of friends who constantly pushed the limits of PC gaming, with this totally rebellious side that didn't hesitate to incorporate violence into their games at a time when it was frowned upon, with the very unique aspect that the studio ultimately had and allowed them to create games that were nowhere else. idSoftware even ended up being bought by a huge company in the 2000s, something they had always refused before to remain free and in control of their creation. Although the name idSoftware still exists, it no longer has the same aura as in the early 90s, despite re-releasing a lot of good games after Quake. idSoftware is one of the most important studios in the history of video games, and what's incredible is to recall that all of this started with just 4 people who wanted to make video games. It's amazing to think that a small group revolutionized the world of gaming, almost without money or resources, starting from scratch and gradually improving with Commander Keen, then Wolfenstein 3D, then Doom, and finally Quake, all while remaining a very small team, always striving to do better. It's hard to think of a game that has left as much of a mark on history as Doom, bringing so much innovation at once, created by a few passionate individuals who loved video games and, because of that, came up with brilliant ideas. These included the concept of death matches, inspired by the fighting games they enjoyed, or the use of violence as satisfying feedback to emphasize the impact of the player's actions. Such ideas could never have emerged from developers working on more conventional projects in more traditional environments. Even more incredible is the speed at which they delivered these groundbreaking games. In just 3 years, they released Commander Keen, then Wolfenstein 3D, and then finally Doom. Even today, it's truly impressive to think that a game as revolutionary as Doom was created in barely a year, a feat that inspires admiration, especially when you consider that the team often worked without weekends or holidays during those periods and turned down astronomical offers to preserve their artistic freedom. This success was also largely thanks to the shareware model, which allowed everyone to experience the technical leap of Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, and Quake for free through their first levels. Players quickly realized how smooth the games were and how compatible they were even with inexpensive computers and components, encouraging sales afterward. Unfortunately, their greatest strength, the lack of strict organization that fostered immense creative freedom, eventually worked against them during the laborious development of Quake. Yet Quake, too, left an indelible mark on the history of video games. idSoftware normalized so many elements that define gaming today: first-person shooters, violence in video games, licensed game engines now ubiquitous in the industry, PC gaming, online multiplayer, shareware, open sharing of source code, leading to ports on nearly every platform, level editors empowering players to create and even sell their own content, forming communities around these games, and developer diaries that offered updates on their projects. It's remarkable to think how a small team of people, in just a few years, reshaped the history of video games so profoundly. Thank you very much for watching this video, which was so complex to make. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like the video and subscribe. It's extremely important for the growth of the channel. See you soon for a new video. Take care.